The Backrooms, the place that shouldn't exist. There is a story shared across the internet that begins with a simple idea. It suggests that reality is far less stable than it appears. Most people move through ordinary life without questioning the walls around them, the floors beneath their feet, or the buildings they enter every day. Homes, schools, offices, hotels, hospitals, and shopping centers all seem permanent and predictable. They obey familiar rules, and those rules give people confidence that the world is understandable. The Backrooms challenges that assumption with a single unsettling question: what if reality could fail? According to the legend, hidden flaws exist within the fabric of the world. Under extremely rare and unpredictable circumstances, a person may accidentally no-clip out of reality, slipping through a solid surface as though the physical world momentarily ceased to exist. Instead of falling into empty space, they emerge somewhere else entirely, a place disconnected from the universe they once knew. That place is called the Backrooms. The earliest version of the story describes an endless maze of aging yellow rooms illuminated by fluorescent lights that never turn off. The rooms appear ordinary at first glance, resembling abandoned office spaces from decades past. Yet everything about them is subtly wrong. The architecture repeats endlessly without purpose. Hallways twist into impossible layouts. Corners reveal more identical rooms. There are no windows leading outside, no functioning exits, and no indication that the structure has any true beginning or end. Unlike traditional horror stories, the original Backrooms contain no monsters. The greatest threat was isolation itself. A person trapped within this endless maze faced the terrifying realization that they might never encounter another living human again. Food, water, sleep, and the passage of time became uncertain, while every attempt to escape only carried them deeper into unfamiliar territory. This simplicity became the foundation of one of the largest collaborative horror universes ever created. As thousands of people contributed their own ideas, the Backrooms expanded far beyond its original concept. New environments emerged, each governed by different rules and hazards. Entire civilizations were imagined living within impossible spaces. Mysterious organizations documented unexplained phenomena. Dangerous entities roamed forgotten corridors. Survival techniques, maps, scientific theories, and historical records gradually transformed a single unsettling image into an immense fictional world with countless interconnected stories. Yet despite this extraordinary expansion, the original question never disappeared. Why did such a simple idea resonate so deeply with millions of people? Unlike ghosts, vampires, or mythical creatures, the Backrooms does not rely on ancient legends or supernatural folklore. Its horror comes from something far more familiar. Nearly everyone has experienced walking through an empty office after business hours, a deserted hotel hallway late at night, an abandoned shopping mall, or a quiet school during summer break. These places are completely ordinary, yet when emptied of people, they often feel strangely unsettling. They appear recognizable while simultaneously feeling unfamiliar, creating a sense that something is subtly out of place. Psychologists often describe these environments as liminal spaces, locations that exist between one destination and another. They are transitional places never intended for prolonged occupation. The Backrooms takes that everyday experience and stretches it to its logical extreme. Instead of passing through these spaces, a person becomes permanently trapped inside them. Over time, the Backrooms evolved into far more than an internet horror story. It became a creative project spanning thousands of writers, artists, filmmakers, game developers, musicians, and researchers. Multiple interpretations emerged, each presenting different explanations for the impossible world. Some focused on survival horror. Others emphasized scientific experimentation, alternate dimensions, psychological symbolism, or cosmic mystery. Independent creators built entirely separate continuities while still preserving the central concept that first captured people's imagination. This documentary follows that complete journey. It begins with the anonymous image that inspired the original legend and traces the Backrooms' transformation into a global collaborative phenomenon. Along the way, it examines the psychology of liminal spaces, the development of its ever-expanding lore, the communities that shaped its evolution, the influence of found footage filmmaking, and the cultural impact of a fictional universe that continues to grow years after its creation. Whether viewed as internet folklore, collaborative storytelling, psychological horror, or modern mythology, the Backrooms remains one of the most remarkable examples of how a single idea can evolve into something far greater than anyone originally imagined. Understanding that evolution requires returning to the very beginning, to one anonymous photograph and a short paragraph that forever changed online horror.
Every story has a beginning, but few begin as quietly as the Backrooms, which emerged from a single, unremarkable photograph posted anonymously on the internet, showing a series of empty yellow rooms that seemed both familiar and strangely disquieting. Capturing the attention of those who encountered it in online communities dedicated to exploring peculiar images and unexplained locations. As more people encountered the photograph, many were struck by an immediate sense of familiarity, reminiscent of forgotten spaces like old office buildings or school corridors, awakening vague and fragmented memories that were difficult to pinpoint, which transformed the mundane setting into a deeply unsettling environment. The discussion surrounding the photograph soon evolved into an intense analysis where users began to scrutinize every visible detail, speculating on what the building might have been and proposing theories that ranged from abandoned office complexes to renovated retail spaces, all while the uncertainty of its origin fueled a growing mystery that captivated the imaginations of many. As theories began to emerge, users hunted for matching wallpaper patterns and ceiling fixtures in hopes of deciphering the building's original purpose. Each attempt to connect the dots, adding another layer of intrigue and contributing to the growing legend of the Backrooms, where unanswered questions continued to provoke new interpretations and expansion of the already rich narrative. The transformation of the photograph into a narrative was solidified when an anonymous user paired it with a brief yet chilling description that suggested the rooms existed not merely as an abandoned building, but as an impossible realm where one could become eternally ensnared by unwittingly taking a wrong step, a notion that would lay the groundwork for an expansive and collaborative universe of horror that captivated countless creators. Together, the photograph and its accompanying text not only provided a haunting setting, but also infused it with meaning, sparking a legend that inspired countless writers, artists, filmmakers, and creators to contribute to what would become one of the internet's largest collaborative fictional universes, marking the true beginning of the Backrooms saga. The haunting allure of the Backrooms continued to grow as more individuals ventured into its depths, each contributing their own interpretations and stories that fed the mythos, transforming it from a simple photograph into a captivating phenomenon that resonated with the fears and curiosities of many, solidifying its place in the realm of internet horror. As the mythos around the Backrooms expanded, stories of those who ventured into this unsettling space multiplied, depicting their experiences of disorientation and fear as they navigated its unyielding architecture, which turned mundane environments into realms of dread, illustrating how a singular image evolved into a profound exploration of the human psyche and the primal fears of being lost and alone. The narrative surrounding the Backrooms grew richer as individuals shared eerie tales of discovering forgotten objects within its confines, each item stirring feelings of nostalgia and longing, while detailed maps created by intrepid explorers highlighted the labyrinthine complexity of this unsettling universe, demonstrating how a solitary photograph could inspire vast and intricate storytelling that captured the imagination of many. As more stories emerged, the fear associated with the Backrooms evolved beyond mere isolation. Accounts of mysterious entities prowling its depths began to surface, leading to a wave of creative interpretations that illustrated these strange beings, heightening the horror and suspense experienced by those who dared to imagine themselves lost in the eerie maze. The narrative tension in the Backrooms intensified as characters faced choices at critical junctures, such as confronting an imposing door that hinted at uncharted territories, reflecting the inner struggle between curiosity and fear, while artists depicted the duality of the space, both eerily tranquil and menacingly chaotic, capturing the essence of its haunting charm that kept explorers yearning for more. As the legends of the Backrooms grew, tales began to include daring adventurers who, armed with flashlights and determination, bravely traversed its vast and perplexing corridors, seeking answers to the mysteries hidden within, while moments of discovery, such as peering through cracks to see glimpses of bizarre and eerie scenes, sparked both wonder and dread, embodying the eternal struggle between exploration and the unknown. Part 1, Chapter 2, The Copypasta That Changed Internet Horror. The photograph introduced the setting, but it was a short, anonymous paragraph that transformed it into a legend. Posted alongside the image, the text was remarkably brief. Unlike traditional horror stories, It did not explain where the backrooms came from, who had discovered them, or whether escape was possible. Instead, it described a single terrifying scenario and left nearly everything else to the reader's imagination. Its opening line became instantly recognizable across the internet. "If you're not careful, and you no-clip out of reality in the wrong areas..." With that sentence, the Backrooms established its central concept. Borrowing the term no-clip from video games, where a command allows players to pass through walls and solid objects, it proposed that reality itself could occasionally malfunction. Under extremely rare circumstances, a person might accidentally slip through the physical world, leaving normal existence behind without warning. Unlike teleportation or magical portals, no-clipping was portrayed as accidental and unpredictable. There was no ritual, machine, or doorway to activate. It simply happened. One moment, someone could be walking through an ordinary hallway, climbing a staircase, leaning against a wall, or stepping across a familiar floor. The next, the laws of physics would fail, and they would find themselves somewhere impossible. That destination was the Backrooms. The original description painted a picture using only a handful of details. It spoke of old, moist carpet stretching endlessly beneath buzzing fluorescent lights. Yellow wallpaper repeated in every direction without variation. The air carried the stale smell of aging buildings. The rooms seemed to continue forever, offering no exits and no evidence that anyone had ever escaped. One sentence in particular defined the psychological horror of the Backrooms. "All you can hear is the endless background noise of fluorescent lights at maximum hum." The danger described was not immediate violence. It was endless existence inside an environment that never changed. Every sense became a source of torment. The constant electrical buzzing offered no silence. The repetitive architecture destroyed any sense of direction. The absence of daylight erased the passage of time. Without people, clocks, weather, or natural sounds, a person's understanding of reality would slowly begin to unravel. The final line introduced the only explicit warning found in the original story. It suggested that something else might already inhabit the endless maze. Importantly, the entity was never described. There was no appearance, no name, and no explanation of what it was capable of doing. Readers were told only that they would hear it before it heard them. That single implication proved far more effective than a detailed monster description could have been. Human imagination naturally filled the empty space, allowing every reader to envision a different, unseen threat lurking somewhere beyond the next hallway. This restraint became one of the Backroom's greatest strengths. The original Copypasta answered almost none of the questions it raised. It never explained why the Backrooms existed, how large they were, whether they had always been there, or if anyone had survived. It offered no maps, no rules beyond accidental no-clipping, and no history. Nearly every aspect of the setting remained unknown. Rather than frustrating readers, these unanswered questions invited participation. People began proposing their own explanations. Some imagined the Backrooms as a parallel universe existing alongside reality. Others believed they were the unfinished framework of existence itself, a hidden layer of the world never intended for human beings. Still others suggested they were a flaw in space-time, an abandoned simulation, or an endless collection of forgotten places stitched together beyond the boundaries of normal physics. Because the original story imposed so few limitations, nearly every new contribution could fit somewhere within the growing mythology. Writers expanded the maze into additional levels. Artists visualized new environments. Filmmakers imagined what it would look like to wander through impossible corridors. Game developers transformed the concept into interactive survival experiences. What began as a few sentences quickly evolved into an open-ended collaborative universe. The timing also played a significant role in the Backroom's success. Internet horror had already been shaped by creepypastas such as Slender Man, The Rake, and other fictional legends that blurred the line between reality and imagination. However, the Backrooms introduced a different kind of fear. Instead of focusing on being hunted through forests or haunted by supernatural beings, it centered on isolation, repetition, and the quiet terror of becoming permanently separated from the world. Its horror came from the environment itself. The maze was the monster. Everything else that followed, hundreds of levels, countless entities, survivor groups, organizations, and competing interpretations, would grow from these few anonymous lines. The original Copypasta did not simply tell a horror story. It created a foundation that millions of people would spend years expanding, transforming one of the shortest internet horror posts ever written into one of the largest collaborative fictional universes in online history. Part 1, Chapter 3. Why it went viral. The Backrooms did not spread because it was the first of its kind. It spread because it arrived at the exact moment the internet was ready for it. By the time the image and Copypasta began circulating widely, online horror had already evolved into something new. Traditional campfire-style storytelling had been replaced by fragmented, collaborative fiction. Entire mythologies were being built in real time across forums, image boards, and social media platforms. Stories were no longer fixed texts. They were living systems, shaped by thousands of anonymous contributors. The Backrooms fit perfectly into that environment. There was no author to credit, no official version to protect, and no canon to restrict interpretation. Instead, there was only a concept, one that was intentionally incomplete. That incompleteness became the engine of its spread. Every person who encountered it felt the same instinct: to explain it, expand it, or reinterpret it. Early discussions appeared in communities focused on unusual images, unsettling architecture, and digital folklore. Users were not just reacting to the image, they were analyzing it. They debated whether the location was real, whether it could be found, and whether similar spaces existed elsewhere. Some treated it like a mystery waiting to be solved. Others treated it like a collaborative creative prompt. As the idea moved from niche forums to broader platforms, its tone began to shift. The Backrooms stopped being just a strange photograph and became a shared framework for storytelling. People began adding levels, describing new environments beyond the original yellow rooms. What started as a single space expanded into an entire structure, with each contributor adding new layers of depth. The concept of levels proved especially powerful. It allowed creators to introduce infinite variation while maintaining consistency. Each level could represent a different environment, rule set, or danger. Some were empty and peaceful. Others were hostile, unstable, or physically impossible. This structure turned the Backrooms into something scalable without limit, encouraging continuous expansion. As more interpretations appeared, the Backrooms became less about a single location and more about a system. It was no longer just a maze of yellow rooms. It was an entire hidden reality composed of interconnected spaces, each with its own logic. This transformation made it ideal for long-form storytelling, games, and visual media. The rise of short-form video platforms played a crucial role in accelerating its spread. The Backrooms was visually simple, yet immediately recognizable. A single image or short clip could communicate its entire concept without explanation. Creators used this to their advantage, producing brief, atmospheric videos that implied stories rather than fully explaining them. Flickering lights, empty hallways, and distorted camera footage became shorthand for the entire mythos. Because the Backrooms relied so heavily on atmosphere rather than narrative complexity, it translated easily across formats. It worked in text posts, images, animations, and gameplay footage. This adaptability allowed it to move rapidly between communities without losing its core identity. Another reason for its viral growth was emotional accessibility. The concept did not require specialized knowledge, prior lore, or complex world-building to understand. Anyone could grasp the fear immediately. The idea of being trapped in an endless, empty building is universally understandable. It taps into a primal discomfort associated with isolation, disorientation, and lack of control. Unlike monsters or supernatural threats that require explanation, the Backrooms relies on familiarity. Most people have experienced environments that resemble it in some way. Empty offices after hours, school hallways during holidays, or commercial spaces that feel abandoned even when they are not. The Backrooms takes these everyday experiences and removes their exit. This emotional connection allowed it to spread beyond horror communities. It reached audiences who did not typically engage with creepypasta or internet lore. Artists began recreating it visually. Developers began building interactive versions. Musicians produced ambient tracks inspired by its atmosphere. Each new interpretation reinforced its presence in online culture. As the concept expanded, debate also emerged around authenticity and canon. Different communities developed competing versions of the Backrooms, each with its own rules and structure. Some emphasized realism and liminal architecture. Others leaned into science fiction, introducing organizations, experiments, and dimensional theories. This fragmentation did not weaken the phenomenon. It strengthened it. The lack of a single authoritative version allowed the Backrooms to evolve in multiple directions simultaneously. At the same time, the anonymity of its origin added to its mystique. Because no one could definitively claim authorship, the Backrooms felt less like a creative work and more like a discovered idea, something that had always existed but was only recently uncovered. This perception encouraged even greater participation, as contributors felt they were not simply building a story but uncovering a hidden reality together. Within a relatively short time, the Backrooms had grown from a single unsettling image into a decentralized mythology. It was no longer confined to one post or one community. It had become a shared cultural artifact, continuously reshaped by everyone who encountered it. What began as a strange photograph and a few anonymous sentences had now become something far larger. A collaborative world without boundaries, sustained not by an author, but by collective imagination. Part 2, Chapter 4. What are liminal spaces? Long before the Backrooms existed as a story, the feeling it describes already existed in everyday life. People move through spaces designed for transition rather than permanence. Hallways connect rooms, airports connect destinations, parking garages connect streets, hotels temporarily hold strangers in unfamiliar cities. Schools empty out after the final bell, offices go silent after working hours. These places are not meant to be lived in, only passed through. These are liminal spaces. The word liminal refers to thresholds, points of transition between one state and another. In architecture and human experience, liminal spaces are environments that exist between destinations rather than being destinations themselves. They are functional, temporary, and usually filled with human activity. But when that activity disappears, something changes in how they are perceived. A hallway is normal when people walk through it. A shopping mall feels ordinary when it is full of noise and movement. A hotel lobby feels welcoming when it is occupied. But when these spaces are emptied, their purpose becomes visible in a way that is usually hidden. They reveal themselves as structures waiting for life rather than containing it. This absence of life creates a specific psychological response. Without people, sound changes. Footsteps echo longer. Mechanical noises become more noticeable. Lighting feels harsher. Shadows behave differently when there is nothing to break them up. The space does not physically change, but perception of it does. The brain, which is constantly searching for meaning and pattern, begins to interpret the emptiness as unusual. It recognizes that something expected is missing. That missing element is human presence. The absence is not threatening in a direct sense, but it creates a subtle sense of wrongness, an awareness that the environment is incomplete. The Backrooms amplifies this sensation by removing almost every form of reassurance. It takes the familiar structure of transitional architecture and removes its function entirely. Hallways no longer lead anywhere meaningful. Rooms no longer serve any purpose. Distance becomes unreliable because repetition erases orientation. The environment stops behaving like a place and begins behaving like a system. In real-world architecture, liminal spaces are unavoidable. They are part of modern infrastructure, but they are rarely experienced in isolation. A person usually passes through them quickly, always moving towards something else. Because of this, they are not typically remembered in detail. Instead, they are stored as vague impressions, flashes of corridors, escalators, elevators, and empty seating areas. The Backrooms takes those vague impressions and stretches them into permanence. Instead of moving through a liminal space, a person becomes trapped inside one. The transition never completes. There is no arrival point. The journey itself becomes the entire existence. This idea is what makes the Backrooms psychologically effective. It does not invent unfamiliar environments. It isolates familiar ones and removes their purpose. A hallway without destination becomes unsettling. An office without work becomes uncanny. A school without students becomes hollow. A hotel without guests becomes suspended in time. This sensation is closely related to what psychologists sometimes describe as the uncanny familiarity effect. It occurs when something is recognizable but placed in a context where it no longer functions as expected. The result is not outright fear, but cognitive dissonance. The brain struggles to reconcile what it sees with what it knows. Liminal spaces often intensify this effect because they are already transitional by design. They are not meant to be emotionally neutral environments. They are meant to be temporary holding points between meaningful experiences. When stripped of movement and purpose, they feel unfinished, as though something should happen, but never does. The Backrooms exaggerates this unfinished quality to an infinite scale. Every corridor suggests continuation. Every room suggests repetition. Every path suggests another identical path beyond it. There is no final destination, no central point, and no clear boundary. The architecture becomes self-referential, looping back into itself without resolution. This structure also reflects a deeper cultural familiarity. Modern environments are often modular and standardized. Office buildings, shopping centers, hotels, and public institutions frequently share similar layouts and materials. Because of this, many people subconsciously recognize patterns across different locations. The Backrooms draws on this shared visual language and removes its context, creating something that feels both new and strangely familiar at the same time. As a result, liminal spaces are not just physical environments. They are emotional experiences tied to memory, expectation, and absence. The Backrooms simply takes that experience and removes the final element that normally prevents it from becoming permanent: the return to normal life. Once that return is gone, the space stops being a transition. It becomes a world. Part 2, Chapter 5, The Psychology of Empty Places. The unease associated with empty places does not come from danger itself, but from interpretation. Human perception is built to assume that environments contain life. The brain constantly scans surroundings for movement, sound, and presence. This system evolved as a survival mechanism. In natural environments, noticing subtle changes, rustling grass, distant footsteps, shifting shadows, could mean the difference between safety and threat. In modern environments, that same system continues to operate even when the threat is not physical. When a space that is normally occupied becomes empty, the brain does not simply register absence. It searches for a reason. An empty hallway is not just a hallway without people. It becomes a question without an answer. Why is it empty? Where did everyone go? Is something wrong, or is this normal? The uncertainty itself becomes the source of discomfort. The Backrooms intensifies this psychological response by removing every possible explanation. There are no visible exits leading to other populated areas. There are no windows showing outside activity. There are no signs, schedules, or environmental cues that indicate function. The space is not just empty. It is disconnected from any larger system that could explain its emptiness. When explanation is removed, the mind begins to generate its own possibilities. This process is known as pattern completion. The brain attempts to fill gaps in information using memory, expectation, and imagination. In most cases, this is harmless and even useful. It allows people to recognize incomplete objects, understand partially heard conversations, and navigate ambiguous situations. But in environments like the Backrooms, pattern completion has no stable reference point. Every corridor looks similar. Every room repeats the same structure. Every attempt to orient oneself leads to more identical spaces. Without variation, the brain loses its ability to build a mental map. Navigation becomes impossible not because the space is complex, but because it is too uniform. This creates a phenomenon similar to sensory disorientation. Humans rely on environmental variation, changes in lighting, sound, texture, and layout, to maintain spatial awareness. When those variations are removed or repeated endlessly, orientation breaks down. The mind begins to lose confidence in its own perception. Time perception is also affected. In environments with minimal change, the brain struggles to measure duration. Without events to mark progression, time becomes abstract. Minutes and hours lose distinction. Sleep cycles become irregular. Memory formation weakens because new experiences are not sufficiently distinct from one another. This contributes to the feeling that time is both accelerating and stagnating simultaneously. The Backrooms concept amplifies this by presenting an environment that appears static but infinite. There is no sunrise or sunset, no natural rhythm, no progression from day to night. The absence of temporal markers removes one of the core structures the human mind uses to organize experience. Isolation compounds these effects. Human cognition is deeply social. Even brief exposure to isolation can alter perception and emotional regulation. In normal life, Environmental uncertainty is balanced by social reassurance. Other people provide confirmation that reality is shared and stable. When that reassurance is removed, uncertainty becomes more difficult to resolve. In the backrooms, the absence of other people is not temporary. It is foundational. The environment does not simply lack individuals. It lacks evidence that individuals exist anywhere within it. This creates a psychological condition in which solitude is not a momentary state, but a permanent assumption. Over time, the mind may begin to reinterpret neutral stimuli as meaningful. Subtle mechanical sounds, electrical hums, or structural creaks may take on heightened significance. In extreme cases, the brain may begin generating perceptions that attempt to restore missing social context. This does not require supernatural explanation. It is a natural response to prolonged ambiguity and deprivation of external input. Memory also becomes unstable under these conditions. Without distinct events, memories begin to blur together. Days cannot be easily distinguished. Experiences lose sequence. The mind may struggle to determine what has already occurred versus what is currently happening. This effect contributes to the perception of endlessness often associated with the backrooms. Importantly, none of these psychological responses require the existence of actual anomalies. The fear arises from how human cognition reacts to environments that remove structure rather than introduce threats. The backrooms works as a concept because it isolates these conditions and extends them indefinitely. It does not rely on monsters or supernatural forces to create tension. Instead, it relies on the breakdown of orientation, memory, and social confirmation. The result is a space that feels alive in its emptiness, not because something is present within it, but because the mind cannot fully accept that nothing is. Part 2, Chapter 6, Dreams and False Memories. There is a strange overlap between dreaming and the idea of the backrooms. Many people describe dreams in which they find themselves in familiar buildings that behave incorrectly. A school corridor stretches farther than it should. A hotel floor contains rooms that do not match its layout. A basement leads to another basement, and then another. Each one slightly different but structurally connected in impossible ways. These environments rarely feel entirely foreign. Instead, they feel like distorted versions of places that might have existed at some point, even if they never truly did. This resemblance is one reason the backrooms concept feels so intuitive. It mirrors the logic of dreams, where architecture is unstable but emotionally coherent. In dreams, spaces are not bound by physics or consistent geography. They shift based on attention, memory, and emotional state. A hallway can become a street. A room can become a maze. Distance can collapse or expand without warning. The backrooms takes this dream logic and presents it as a physical reality. In doing so, it removes one of the key protections the waking mind relies on, the assumption that instability is temporary. Dreams are accepted as unreal because they end. Upon waking, the mind resets its expectations and returns to a stable environment. The backrooms removes that reset. It suggests a place where dreamlike inconsistency is permanent and inescapable. This creates a psychological overlap between memory and imagination. People often report false memories of places they have never visited but feel they recognize. These impressions are usually weak, fragmented, and difficult to verify. They may come from childhood experiences, media exposure, or incidental glimpses of similar environments. A long hallway in one building may resemble another seen years later. A hotel corridor in a film may feel identical to one experienced in real life. Over time, these fragments can merge into a sense of familiarity without a clear origin. The backrooms draws heavily on this phenomenon. Its environments are deliberately constructed from architectural elements that are widespread and repetitive in modern life. Fluorescent lighting, industrial carpeting, modular office walls, drop ceilings, and standardized corridor layouts are common across countless buildings. Because of this repetition, the mind stores them not as unique locations, but as interchangeable patterns. When these patterns are removed from context and recombined without purpose, they begin to resemble memory fragments rather than real places. This is why the backrooms feels like something that might already exist somewhere in the world, even though no such unified structure has ever been confirmed. In this sense, the backrooms operates like a collective false memory. It is not tied to one person's experience, but to many overlapping impressions of similar environments. Each individual contributes small pieces: an empty school, a dim hallway, a quiet office after hours. When combined, these fragments form a coherent but fictional structure that feels oddly recognizable. Dream logic further reinforces this effect. In dreams, transitions between spaces are often abrupt and unexplained. A person may walk through a door and find themselves in an entirely different environment without noticing the change. The mind does not question this shift during the dream state because continuity is not required. Only emotional consistency matters. The Backrooms mirrors this structure precisely. It allows for sudden changes in level, environment, or architecture without explanation. A doorway may lead to an entirely different reality. A staircase may descend into impossible geometry. A corridor may loop back on itself without visible cause. These transitions feel acceptable within the narrative because they resemble the logic of unconscious thought. There is also the phenomenon of hypnagogic perception, the transitional state between wakefulness and sleep. During this phase, the brain can produce vivid, dreamlike imagery while still partially aware of the physical world. People in this state often report fragmented environments, repetitive spaces, or distorted versions of familiar rooms. These experiences are brief but can leave strong impressions that feel partially real upon waking. The Backrooms shares structural similarities with these experiences, which may explain why it feels so psychologically accessible. It does not require the imagination to construct entirely new worlds. Instead, it reorganizes familiar ones into unstable configurations. This blending of memory, dream logic, and architectural familiarity creates a unique form of narrative realism. The Backrooms does not ask the audience to believe in something entirely alien. It asks them to consider what would happen if the most ordinary environments they encounter every day stopped behaving consistently. In that sense, the horror is not rooted in fantasy. It is rooted in recognition without certainty. And that uncertainty is exactly what makes the Backrooms feel like something that could exist just beyond the edge of waking perception. Never fully seen, but never entirely forgotten either. Part 3, Chapter 7. The expanding universe begins. Once the Backrooms moved beyond its original image and short text, it stopped being a single idea and became something closer to a shared construction site. Nothing about it remained fixed. Every new interpretation added another layer, another rule, another direction the concept could evolve. At first, expansion was slow and informal. People treated it like a creative exercise. What else could exist inside this place? If the yellow rooms were only the first layer, what came after them? If someone could no-clip into one section of reality, could there be deeper sections still? These questions did not have official answers, but they did not need them. The lack of structure became the structure itself. As discussions continued, the idea of levels naturally emerged. It was a simple organizing tool at first, just a way to separate different environments. But it quickly became something larger. Each level was treated as a distinct layer of reality with its own rules, dangers, and architecture. Instead of one endless maze, the Backrooms became an infinite stack of worlds. This shift changed everything. The Backrooms was no longer just a location. It was now a system. Writers began contributing their own levels freely. Some expanded on existing ideas, while others introduced entirely new environments with no connection to earlier interpretations. The result was not a single coherent map, but a growing archive of overlapping realities. Some levels were structured and detailed, others were abstract or symbolic. Some contradicted each other entirely. Instead of weakening the concept, this contradiction strengthened it. Because there was no central authority, every version became simultaneously valid. The Backrooms became less like a story and more like a database of impossible places. Each entry added depth without requiring consistency. Communities formed around cataloging these expansions. Lists of levels were created, revised, reorganized, and reinterpreted. What started as casual additions turned into structured documentation efforts, as if people were recording a real but unstable phenomenon. At the same time, new narrative elements began to appear alongside the levels. Entities were introduced to populate the spaces. Survival systems were invented to explain how anyone could persist inside them. Organizations were created to study or navigate the structure. What had once been an empty environment slowly developed into a populated, functioning ecosystem. But even then, nothing stayed unified for long. Different communities developed different versions of the Backrooms. Some focused on realism and psychological horror. Others leaned into science fiction explanations. Some treated it as a dreamlike metaphor. Others framed it as a physical alternate dimension. Each interpretation expanded independently, creating parallel continuities that rarely aligned. Instead of resolving into a single canon, the Backrooms fractured into many, and that fracture became its defining feature. The more it expanded, the less it needed agreement. Every contradiction simply became another possible layer. Every variation became another version of reality. The Backrooms was no longer a place someone could fully map. It had become something closer to an infinite conversation, and that conversation was only just beginning. Part 3, Chapter 8. The level system becomes structure. As the Backrooms continued to expand, the idea of levels stopped being just a convenient way to separate environments and became the core organizing principle of the entire mythology. What began as informal categorization gradually turned into something resembling structure. Instead of describing isolated spaces, contributors started thinking in terms of layered reality. Each level was no longer just another location, but a defined condition of existence with its own logic, hazards, and behavior patterns. This shift changed how the Backrooms was understood. It was no longer imagined as one endless maze. It was now interpreted as a stacked system of environments, each one potentially accessible from the others through unstable transitions, hidden connections, or unpredictable shifts in space. The earliest widely recognized levels reinforced this structure. The so-called foundational layers established a sense of progression. The initial environment represented familiarity and repetition. Subsequent layers introduced complexity, instability, and environmental variation. Even without formal agreement, a pattern emerged. Deeper levels tended to feel more extreme, more abstract, or more dangerous. This created a psychological expectation of descent. Movement through the Backrooms was no longer neutral. It implied progression into something increasingly removed from normal reality. Whether or not deeper, levels were literally lower or higher became irrelevant. What mattered was the perception of movement away from stability. As the system grew, cataloging efforts intensified. Communities began compiling lists of known levels, assigning numbers, descriptions, and classifications. These lists were not static. They changed constantly as new interpretations were added, merged, or contradicted earlier versions. In some cases, multiple levels shared similar names or characteristics, but differed in detail depending on the source. This lack of standardization did not disrupt the system. It became part of it. The level structure was flexible enough to absorb contradiction without breaking. Two incompatible descriptions of the same level could coexist as separate interpretations. A single environment could be reclassified, renamed, or reimagined entirely, while still remaining valid within the broader mythology. The system did not enforce consistency, it absorbed variation. Over time, certain levels became culturally significant within the community. These were not necessarily the most detailed or complex, but the most widely recognized. They often served as reference points for understanding what the Backrooms could contain. Some emphasized safety and exploration, while others represented danger, psychological instability, or environmental collapse. These recurring levels functioned as shared landmarks within an otherwise unbounded system. At the same time, the number of levels expanded rapidly. As more creators contributed, the structure grew beyond practical documentation. Hundreds of levels became thousands, each with unique descriptions, ecosystems, and internal logic. Some were fully developed with detailed rules and narratives. Others existed only as brief concepts or fragmented ideas. Eventually, the system reached a point where completeness was no longer possible. No single record could contain the entire structure. The level system had effectively become infinite. Despite this, the concept remained stable because it did not depend on accuracy. It depended on expansion. The purpose of the system was not to define the Backrooms, but to provide a framework through which it could continuously grow. In this way, the level system functioned less like a map and more like a language. It allowed people to communicate about impossible spaces using shared terms, even when those spaces contradicted one another. A level number did not guarantee consistency. It guaranteed participation. The Backrooms, once a single image and a short paragraph, had now become an evolving architecture of classification. Every new contribution did not complete the system. It extended it further. And the deeper it grew, the more inevitable it became that no one would ever reach the end. Part 3, Chapter 9. canon, fanon, and the many versions of the Backrooms. As the Backrooms continued to grow, one question appeared more often than any other. Which version is the real one? Unlike most fictional worlds, the Backrooms was never created with a single author overseeing its development. There was no official guidebook, no master timeline, and no definitive set of rules that every contributor was required to follow. From the beginning, the concept belonged to the community as much as it belonged to the anonymous post that inspired it. This freedom encouraged creativity, but it also created multiple competing interpretations of the same universe. Some creators believed the original concept should remain as simple as possible. To them, the Backrooms was at its most effective when it consisted of endless empty rooms, subtle psychological tension, and very few explanations. They argued that adding too many monsters, civilizations, or detailed systems weakened the mystery that made the original story so powerful. Others saw the Backrooms as a foundation rather than a finished idea. They expanded it into a vast fictional universe containing hundreds of levels, organized survivor groups, dangerous entities, environmental classifications, and detailed survival guides. In this interpretation, the Backrooms became a complete setting capable of supporting novels, games, and long-form storytelling. Neither approach replaced the other. Instead, both continued to exist side by side. As more communities formed, separate collections of lore began to emerge. Each developed its own standards, terminology, and internal consistency. Some focused on detailed documentation, treating every level as if it were part of a scientific field guide. Others emphasized storytelling, using the Backrooms as a backdrop for personal narratives and found footage experiences. These differences gradually produced what fans began calling different canons. A canon is a body of information accepted as internally consistent within a particular version of a fictional universe. Because the Backrooms had no single governing authority, multiple canons developed independently. A level, entity, or organization considered essential in one version might not exist at all in another. Alongside canon came another term frequently used within the community: fanon. Fanon refers to ideas that become widely accepted by fans without being universally recognized across every interpretation. In many fictional communities, fanon develops when popular concepts spread through repeated use until they feel official, even though they were created by individual contributors. The Backrooms became one of the clearest examples of this process. Many of its best-known concepts originated not from the original post, but from later community contributions. As these ideas were repeated across stories, videos, artwork, and games, they became deeply associated with the Backrooms regardless of which continuity they belonged to. This constant blending of canon and fanon created a unique form of collaborative storytelling. Rather than competing for authority, creators often borrowed ideas from multiple sources, adapting them to fit their own interpretations. A filmmaker might use entities from one community, levels from another, and entirely original concepts alongside them. The result was a mythology that expanded through recombination rather than strict continuity. This flexibility also encouraged innovation. Because no version could permanently define the Backrooms, every creator had the opportunity to introduce new ideas without contradicting an official source. Entire continuities emerged that shared little beyond the central premise of accidentally entering an impossible reality. Some emphasized existential horror. Others leaned toward science fiction, mystery, survival, or cosmic speculation. One of the most influential developments came from creators who reimagined the Backrooms not as a supernatural phenomenon, but as the result of scientific experimentation. This interpretation introduced research facilities, dimensional instability, and attempts to artificially access the Backrooms through technology. Although separate from many earlier community versions, it would eventually become one of the most recognizable interpretations in modern internet horror. By this point, the Backrooms had become less like a single fictional setting and more like a modern mythology. Just as ancient legends evolved through generations of storytellers, the Backrooms changed as each creator added new perspectives. There was no single correct version, only different traditions built around the same foundational idea. This absence of a definitive canon is not a flaw in the Backrooms. It is one of its defining strengths. The Backrooms survives because it remains open to reinterpretation. Every new story, film, game, or artwork becomes another branch of an ever-expanding mythos, ensuring that the legend never reaches a final, unchangeable form. And among those many interpretations, one would soon reshape public perception of the Backrooms more than any other before it. Chapter 10. The Major Levels. The original Backrooms consisted of a single environment, an endless maze of yellow rooms illuminated by fluorescent lights. For a time, this was enough. The mystery came from not knowing where the corridors ended, or whether they ended at all. But as the community surrounding the Backrooms expanded, creators began asking a natural question. What lies beyond the yellow rooms? The answer was not a single location, but an entire hidden world. Rather than imagining the Backrooms as one infinite office, contributors envisioned it as a layered reality made up of countless interconnected environments. Each environment became known as a level, a distinct region with its own appearance, hazards, and internal logic. Some levels resembled places found in the real world, while others abandoned realism entirely, presenting landscapes that could exist only in fiction. The earliest levels remained close to the original concept. They featured abandoned offices, industrial maintenance corridors, utility tunnels, and empty commercial spaces. These environments preserved the central themes of isolation and repetition, while gradually introducing greater environmental variety. They suggested that the Backrooms was not simply one building, but an immense network of forgotten spaces stitched together beyond ordinary reality. As creators became more ambitious, the range of environments expanded dramatically. Endless hotel hallways appeared alongside flooded corridors, underground cave systems, abandoned suburbs, sprawling office complexes, silent apartment buildings, and artificial cities stretching beyond the horizon. Each level explored a different aspect of architectural unease, demonstrating that almost any familiar environment could become unsettling when stripped of people, purpose, and context. Some levels emphasized survival. Their dangers came from unstable terrain, environmental hazards, or limited resources. Others focused on psychological horror, using repetitive layouts, distorted perception, or overwhelming silence to create tension. Still others embraced surrealism, abandoning conventional architecture in favor of impossible geometry, endless oceans, floating structures, or landscapes that ignored the normal laws of physics. Over time, certain levels achieved iconic status within the community. The original yellow rooms remained the symbolic entry point into the Backrooms, representing the moment reality first breaks apart. The endless hotel corridors became synonymous with quiet dread, transforming a place associated with temporary comfort into one of endless uncertainty. Flooded chambers inspired the now famous pool rooms aesthetic, where calm blue water and tiled walls created beauty and unease in equal measure. Vast cities without inhabitants explored the fear of civilization continuing after humanity had vanished. Open fields beneath artificial skies challenged the expectation that the Backrooms must always be confined spaces, proving that infinite openness could feel just as isolating as endless corridors. Not every level was dangerous in the same way. Some were considered relatively stable, allowing survivors to rest, gather supplies, or establish temporary communities. Others were regarded as almost impossible to endure due to environmental instability, hostile entities, or unpredictable spatial behavior. This variation transformed exploration into a constant process of risk assessment. Every transition carried uncertainty because no traveler could be completely certain what awaited on the other side. As the number of levels increased, the Backrooms became impossible to fully catalog. New environments appeared faster than existing ones could be documented. Some were richly developed with extensive histories and survival guides. Others existed only as brief descriptions or unfinished concepts. Contradictions accumulated as different communities proposed alternative versions of the same locations, each internally consistent within its own continuity. Rather than diminishing the mythology, this endless expansion reinforced one of its central ideas. The Backrooms cannot be completely understood. Every attempt to map the structure reveals only another portion of something far larger. Every discovered level implies the existence of countless more waiting beyond it. The numbered system creates the illusion of order, but beneath that order lies infinity. In this way, the levels are more than settings for individual stories. Together, they form the architecture of the Backrooms itself, a reality composed of familiar places transformed into endless, interconnected spaces where certainty is always temporary, exploration is never complete, and every new discovery leads only to another unanswered question. Part 4, Chapter 11, The Evolution of the Levels. As the number of levels grew, the Backrooms underwent a transformation that was as much philosophical as it was structural. The environments themselves began to change, reflecting shifts in how the community understood the purpose of the Backrooms. In its earliest stage, the Backrooms was defined by restraint. The original yellow rooms contained almost no visual complexity. There were no dramatic landscapes, elaborate histories, or intricate systems. Their power came from repetition. Every hallway looked nearly identical to the last, creating a feeling that the environment itself was slowly erasing the distinction between one place and another. The first community-created levels largely preserved this approach. They remained grounded in architecture that could plausibly exist in the real world. Industrial facilities, office buildings, hotels, warehouses, maintenance tunnels, and utility corridors expanded upon the original concept without abandoning it. These environments felt unsettling because they resembled places people might actually encounter, only stripped of purpose and stretched beyond possibility. As more contributors joined the project, however, the range of ideas widened considerably. Creators began exploring settings that moved beyond conventional architecture, while still preserving the emotional qualities that made the Backrooms distinctive. Flooded chambers, endless apartment complexes, abandoned cities, underground cave systems, and sprawling suburban neighborhoods appeared alongside the familiar office corridors. Each new environment demonstrated that liminality was not limited to commercial buildings. It could emerge anywhere familiarity and emptiness intersected. This marked the beginning of the Backrooms' second stage of development. Rather than focusing solely on repetition, creators explored variation. Every new level became an opportunity to examine a different kind of isolation. Some emphasized silence. Others highlighted environmental danger, sensory deprivation, or distorted geography. The Backrooms evolved from one recurring nightmare into an anthology of impossible places, each expressing a different form of psychological unease. As the mythology continued to expand, a third stage emerged, one defined by abstraction. Some levels no longer resembled recognizable buildings at all. Instead, they became conceptual landscapes where ordinary physical rules no longer applied. Endless oceans existed beneath enclosed ceilings. Cities stretched infinitely in every direction without signs of life. Vast fields extended beneath skies that never changed. Staircases led into impossible geometries, while corridors folded back upon themselves in ways that defied conventional architecture. These environments were no longer frightening because they resembled reality. They were frightening because they resembled dreams. This increasing surrealism reflected the growing diversity of the Backrooms community. Some creators remained committed to the grounded horror of abandoned buildings and liminal architecture. Others embraced cosmic horror, speculative science fiction, or symbolic storytelling. Rather than replacing one another, these approaches existed simultaneously, creating multiple interpretations of what the Backrooms could represent. The popularity of found footage filmmaking also influenced the evolution of level design. Environments became more cinematic, emphasizing dramatic lighting, unusual scale, and visual storytelling. Long corridors, impossible stairwells, flooded rooms, and monumental industrial spaces were designed not only to be imagined, but also to be filmed, animated, and explored interactively. Video games introduced another perspective. Level design increasingly considered navigation, exploration, and gameplay. Some environments became sprawling mazes intended to challenge orientation, while others served as temporary refuges where players could gather resources or prepare for more dangerous regions. The Backrooms was no longer confined to written descriptions. It had become a world people could virtually enter. Throughout these changes, one principle remained remarkably consistent. Every successful level preserved a sense of uncertainty, whether depicting an abandoned office, an infinite hotel, a flooded chamber, or a city without inhabitants. The most memorable environments all shared a common characteristic. They felt as though they should make sense, yet never fully did. They invited exploration while resisting complete understanding. This balance between familiarity and impossibility became the defining characteristic of the Backrooms' evolving architecture. The community discovered that the Backrooms did not require yellow wallpaper to remain recognizable. It required only a place where normal expectations quietly failed, where architecture continued beyond reason, where purpose had been forgotten, and where every path suggested that something larger remained hidden just out of sight. In the end, the evolution of the levels reflected the evolution of the community itself. What began as one unsettling room became an ever-expanding collection of impossible worlds, each offering a different answer to the same question. What happens when a place designed for ordinary life loses the reality that once gave it meaning?
Part 4, Chapter 12, Life Between the Levels.
Between one level and another, there is rarely a clear transition. In most accounts, movement through the Backrooms does not follow stable geography. A hallway does not reliably lead to another hallway. A door does not consistently open into the same space twice. Instead, the structure behaves as if it is partially disconnected from itself, patched together in ways that can shift without warning. This is where the idea of no-clipping becomes central again. No-clipping is not treated as a controlled action, but as an accidental rupture. Individuals do not choose to move between levels so much as they fall through inconsistencies in reality. A wall may behave like a boundary in one moment and a passage in the next. A staircase may descend into a known environment or into something entirely unrelated. Because of this instability, travel in the Backrooms is not directional. It is conditional. Some levels are described as having stable entry points, repeating thresholds where transitions occur with relative predictability. Others are volatile, appearing only briefly before collapsing or shifting into something else entirely. In many interpretations, the same physical location may lead to different destinations depending on timing, state of mind, or unknown environmental variables. There are also what survivors refer to as dead transitions. These are passages that do not lead anywhere recognizable. Movement continues, but the environment never resolves into a stable level. Instead, space appears to extend without definition, as if the act of transition itself has broken down. These regions are rarely described in detail, partly because few accounts of them remain consistent. On the opposite end are stable intersections. These are rare zones where multiple levels appear to connect in repeatable ways. In theory, they allow structured movement across the Backrooms. In practice, even these intersections are unreliable, as their configuration may change over time or differ between observers. This unpredictability means that mapping the Backrooms is less about drawing geography and more about documenting probability. Survivors often rely on pattern recognition rather than fixed routes. Small environmental cues, changes in lighting temperature, wall texture, sound resonance, or structural repetition, are used to estimate what type of space might come next. These cues are never fully reliable, but they offer the only form of orientation available. Over time, a broader theory emerges in some interpretations. The Backrooms is not a place one moves through, but a system that decides where movement leads.